is how many people's lives did we change by those bike sales, but more importantly is how many could we have sold? How many people's lives could we have changed, right? What's the headroom? What's the possibility that we didn't capture? Am I at 50% attainment? Am I 120% attainment? Am I outperforming the benchmarks? So you're trying to quantify a benchmark of what's possible in a store. And that sounds like a very subjective, well, how do we know what's possible in the store? What's possible in Idaho versus what's possible in SoCal may be really, really different. You have one building and you have 4 buildings or 5. How many buildings do you have now? Yeah, like their stores broken up into sections in different buildings, right? So how can you quantify one versus another? How do you compare apples to apples? Well, one way we started trying to do that was in 2001 was the swing counter. How many times did the front door swing open? How many opportunities at bat did you have to sell someone a motorcycle? The problem is when you have 2 buildings and you have 1, do I put a door swing counter on both buildings? What if my service department is connected? What if it's not connected? Is there a service department? Is there a swing counter there? What if my bikes are upstairs and yours are downstairs? Do I put the swing counter on the stairwell or the front door? What if he's only coming in for parts, right? There's all these people are throwing that number out, and you couldn't get a real take on how do I compare your store to your store in the meeting. What it did tell us was when you'd call back and a parts counter person would say, yeah, it's really slow today, boss. And you'd say, really? Because the door swung open 713 times. Did you want to tell me how slow it is again today? There was an awareness factor the swing counter brought to the table that we'd never had in the past. Like it actually wasn't slow, it might have felt slow, but 700 times that front door swung open. Where are those people? It put some accountability into play where people are like, oh, I guess there really are some people here. We just never ended up talking to them. We got away from swing counters and we started thinking about what is something, the swing counter and the traffic log are so volatile, what's something that's stable? Well, we started fixating on a number that came out of a report from Power Sports Business Magazine, which was that 94% of the time at the parts counter, if somebody goes to the parts counter, they buy something, 94% of the time. That's a stable number, as opposed to 8 to 10% closing ratio in the sales department. That's a very volatile number, right? We do everything right and we still only close 8% of the deals. 94% of the time somebody buys something at the parts counter. Now, whether they buy 1 or 5 has to do with the salesmanship of the person standing behind the counter. But there's an invoice created. There's a transaction that happened 94% of the time. So why don't we take the stability of that number and say, what else in the store is stable? Okay, if my bike goes clunk in 3rd gear and I bring it to the service department, there's a really good chance we're going to open a repair order. That's very stable compared to the volatility of the sales department. So we started looking at the invoices or transactions. Those words are synonymous with what I'm talking about. In other words, there was somebody traded money for something in the parts department, service department, clothing department, relative to the volatility of the sales and F&I department. Right? We started trying to compare ratios of activity over here in the stable departments to activity over here in the volatile departments to figure out what should that benchmark be. We started this in the Harley-Davidson side of the fence because we do a lot of work with Harley. In 2009, I had 4 groups that I was moderating for Harley, which means it was a Harley-based group run by Harley, and then I would come in to moderate their meetings for them. So we all agreed we'd start tracking transactional data. And for people who've never looked at the number before, when you start looking at how many bikes should have gone down the road for how many stable transactions happened over here, most people, again on the Harley side of the fence, I'll pull it over into metric and then euro, but on the Harley side of the fence we said, guys who had never tracked it before were coming up in the 40s. In other words, there were 40 transactions happening over here for every 1 bike that we delivered over here. All right, was that a good number or a bad number? I don't know. Let's start looking at it. Well, 40 became 38, became 36, became 35, became 33, and for the dealers who are really tracking it, they started getting under 30. So we said, you know what? The benchmark will be 30. Let's run with 30. You should have 1 bike going down the road for every 30 stable transactions that happen in a Harley store. And this would be everything other than sales and F&I, right? What happens is when you're dividing by when you're comparing a ratio to something that's very stable, you can see how the lower that ratio gets, 1 to 30, 1 to 28, 1 to 26, that just it doesn't mean we're selling less of these things because these are stable. It means we're selling more motorcycles, right? So the motorcycle sales kept going up the more attention we put towards that ratio. Well, we got to start looking at that ratio harder. Our benchmark, our goal was 1 to 30, which ultimately became 1 to 25 on the Harley side of the fence. So imagine this, if you've never looked at your numbers before, and your numbers say you're at 1 to 50, and I tell you the goal is 1 to 25, how many bikes should you have delivered last year?
Double.
Twice as many as you did. Do you know what a hard pill that is to swallow for most dealers who tell me I delivered 300 bikes and I say you should have delivered 6? The first response is always, well, that's bullshit. That's 600 bikes. You're out of your mind. And then they start coming to the meetings and they start watching people around them close that gap. And they start watching people around them deliver almost twice as many units. And at some point, it's usually about year 2 of coming to meetings, they're like, that really is attainable. And then they go after it. And then they start hitting those numbers and they start teaching everybody else. It is the most profound, the biggest, most huge opportunity for improvement has to do with hitting these transactional benchmarks, okay? Our goal for Harley is at 1 to 25, even though I was just in California 2 weeks ago and some of those guys are running 1 to 18, 1 to 19, right? When you're running 1 to 18 and 19 and the other guys are running 1 to 40, you're crushing the competition, crushing it, destroying it. Harley has a lot more knickknacks inside their store. They have a lot more dog collars and shot glasses and stuff than metric dealers and European dealers, for sure. So that number for the dealers that we were tracking it, we waited for 2 years of data to come in and we said, okay, so transactionally, a metric, as in a non-Harley dealer, should be at 1 to 15. For Harley dealers at 1 to 25, the metric dealer should be at 1 to 15. I want 1 bike delivered for every 15 activities happening in parts, clothing, service department over here, right? We just had less things to track. I will tell you that those dealers, those metric dealers, are now inside of 1 to 12. The bench they thought was 1 to 15 is 1 to 12, which means the European benchmark is probably closer to 1 to 10. 1 to 10. You should have 1 bike going down the road for every 10 transactions happening inside the store. If you've never done that before and you run your numbers and you're at 1 to 30, it's really easy to do, by the way. Just call whoever's at your store and say, can you run a report of how many transactions, how many exchanges for money happened in the store for any given time period, a day, a week, a month, and divide by 15, use our old benchmark, divide by 15, and that's how many bikes you should have delivered. Divide by 12, that's how many bikes on the new benchmark you should have delivered. Yeah, so if you want to get technical, we would then back out internal things. I want customer-based activities. The first swing is just take the total number of transactions. The second swing is back out internals. I'm trying to measure a customer was in my store and either went over there or had the opportunity to go over here and buy a new motorcycle. That's really what we're trying to measure. But if you just take your transactions and divide by 12 or 15, it'll shock you of how many bikes you should have delivered versus how many bikes you did deliver. And all that means is that someone was in your store that could have been given an opportunity to buy a motorcycle, and we just said, well, he's here for a part. Well, if he's here for a part, what is he getting a part for? A broken bike, which means he's part of our 2.88% of people who ride bikes. He's just not at touch 19, ready to pull the trigger on the next bike. Can you get him to touch 19, or do you just want him to leave and you never follow up with him and you hope he comes back? Why aren't we putting people in the parts department on the traffic log? Why aren't we putting people in the service department on the traffic log? Why aren't we putting people in the clothing department on the traffic log?
Yeah. It's kind of like my thing, like at my shop, we've got 5 guys on the floor. All of them, they like to be out on the floor. I have my things right inside the service department right there. So if there's a guy who's having, he doesn't want to face it, I'll take the share. That's what we need about.
So, I love that you're there. You shouldn't have to be there. Your sales guys should be going into the service department. Whether they do or not, I love that you're there to catch them when they don't. And it shouldn't have to be that I don't want to fix it. It should be somebody in the service department, the service writer, saying, I got a $1,200 repair order here. You ever thought about a new one? And flagging the sales guy to get the sales guy involved in the transaction. Because at the end of the day, we all work for the sales department. And you in the other departments, I know you don't want to hear that. Because in your mind, service guys, you think sales guys are the guys that just stand around doing nothing all day long. I know. But if my closing rate is 10%, let me just ask you service people, if you fixed 100 motorcycles and 90 of them came back broken, how do you feel about yourself? Because the sales guys can do everything right and close 10% of the deals. It's the same equivalent of you fixing 100 bikes correctly and 90% of them came back broken. And you have to deal with that day in, day out. It's a different skill set to work on the sales floor than it is on the, Javier, you're figuring that out, right? It's a different skill set in sales than it was in service. But everybody needs to be looking for the next motorcycle sale. 80% of the revenue of a store can come from the sales department. If run efficiently, a store will generate 80% of the revenue from the sales department, right? So think about that. That means we can't accessorize it till we sell it. We can't service it till we sell it. Nobody's buying a new Arai helmet until they buy the new motorcycle. And I say nobody, I realize some people are, but for the most part, it's after you pull the trigger on the unit that you start buying all the ancillary pieces. Everybody should be looking for, how do we get another motorcycle sale? Service needs to be looking for how to get another motorcycle sale. When a guy's, and by the way, I bring my bike in, when's the service department, what time of day is the service department the busiest? Morning. What time of day is the sales department the slowest? Morning. Why in God's name aren't the salespeople in the service drive?
Well, when one of the last ones they went to Grand Auto, but they did they had a salesman sitting in the service center every morning from 8 to 9:30. Every morning.
Every morning.
They rotate out every week.
As it should be.
Gets off an hour